Okay, this is a lecture on Chapter 8, the second part of it. And again, if you remember right, this is all about the social and emotional development of children in Piaget's pre-operational stage mostly. Um, now, a couple of things that they're doing. This side of the chapter, this is about from page 208 on, is what I'll be talking about today. Um, there's a section on page 208 that says applying what we know. Um, and there's a couple of problems with this. First of all, I mentioned yesterday in the other chapter uh, that there was a slight problem on um, how to apply certain punishments. Say corporal punishments, how to do it properly. Um, I personally find it very irresponsible to. On page 208, she talks about how to apply certain punishments that make you feel happy, how to apply them well. And this is great, but the reason I don't want to dwell on this sort of thing is because pretty much anybody can do. Parents really like, especially in modern times, really like certain parenting styles, like ones that allow them to reward children instead of punish them. Doing things like timeouts instead of spankings, and they like this because it makes them feel happy. Whether it has anything to do with child rearing or not is irrelevant. Um, there are because ultimately whether or not it's better or worse for child rearing largely depends on what you're going for. Not every parent wants the same sort of child in the long run. So even just to make a blanket statement that this is more successful or this is not more successful is very, like I said, kind of irresponsible to do, because it depends on success based on what metric. What are you trying to do? Are you just trying to get a kid who obeys, who shuts up and obeys? A lot of parents want children like that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That is what they're going for, and certain strategies will work better to get that thing. And then work awful to get another different type of child. Um, so the chart on page 208, first of all, it ignores a lot of the developmental milestones. And I do want you to look at the chart. It ignores some of the developmental milestones because you can't just talk to some children of certain ages if they haven't gotten to the point where they can understand what you're saying and really just internalize it. Then your words are a cognitive exercise for them, which, like I said, is useful but not all that functional for changing their behaviors. The other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of you are not going to just be hermits. A lot of you are actually going to meet other people in your lives, and they're going to do these things. Like if you're going to wind up being a nurse, if you're going to be any sort of mental health professional, social service worker, a public health worker, anything in clinical psychology, you have to know how to use these other tactics because parents are going to use them, and you can't just shun them. You can't just say that they're bad. You have to know how to make these tactics good, because a lot of these are almost religious beliefs. If parents will religiously believe that spanking their children is good. And you have to accept this reality. If you're, say, a social worker, you have to accept this reality that these parents are going to be spanking their children anyway. So it is irresponsible to try to talk them out of it because you're just wasting your breath. Have them make it the most effective as possible, which is why I went over the rules for spanking your children last time. These rules don't need to be hidden. They need to be disseminated out into the public. Not to encourage the behavior, but to make it so that the people doing it at least do it well. Because any punishment can have drawbacks if you do it badly. Anything on child rearing is going to have drawbacks if you do it badly. Um, um, One of the things that they encourage in the book, and I just wanted to be more specific on this because it is so easy to go overboard with this, is encouraging children. And obviously you have to encourage children, but we have to understand that we have a tendency to repeat ourselves with children because children don't always understand us. And we're kind of pretending that they're little us's. But at the same time, we know they're not that smart, so we just say the same thing over and over and over again. Uh, and we forget sometimes the effect that that has on these people. So we, for example, love to encourage children. We love to see them try to strive and do good things. But one of the drawbacks is that you can often encourage children to fail. You can encourage them basically to be losers. Um, I'll give you a personal example. When I was a young boy, I was a great singer. I had the gift of song. I was in all the school plays. Whenever there was a concert, a parade, they had me doing the singing, and then I stopped singing and just got out of practice on it. But my children do not have the gift of song by any stretch of the imagination. To hear them attempt to sing is pain. Um, and so while I encourage them to explore new things, I don't try to fool them into thinking that they're talented when they're not. Because I would rather a child only has so much attention to give. A human only has so much attention to give. And if you encourage them in things that they're only destined to fail in, if I were to encourage my children to be singers, all I'm doing is encouraging them to be losers. Now, because they will not be good at this. They're maybe after puberty I'll try again, but it's just not something they're going to excel at. If they're interested in music, we can have them learn to play the piano, learn to play the guitar, learn to do songwriting perhaps. There's a lot of other things that they can do without encouraging them to fail. Just a few months ago, I took my 2-year-old daughter to a school dance. It was an all-girls school, so they were fairly comfortable having a school dance. And at one point, one of the teachers said, well, there's a birthday girl, and one of our girls wants to sing happy birthday to another girl. So they gave this girl the microphone, and there was a big throng around her, so I couldn't see who it was. And they gave this girl the microphone, and she just said, happy birthday, happy birthday, happy birthday. Like she was out of breath with every syllable. And she did this for 4 minutes. I mean, after about 30 seconds, you're like, really? And she just kept going and going and going. And the same words, happy birthday, like she was out of breath on every syllable. I'm surprised the other girls didn't get together and form a lynch mob after about 3 minutes. It was painful to listen to. And then afterwards, the teacher, who had 4 minutes to think of something to say to this girl, said, well, thank you. That was very brave of you. I mean, that's the best she could say. She couldn't say it was good. She just said it was brave. Jumping off a cliff is brave. It's just not particularly a smart thing to do either. So it can be difficult when you're caught in these situations with children to see them clearly fail, completely incapable of doing something. Typically, the best thing to do is to redirect them into things that they aren't as bad at. You don't have to encourage them at everything, just like you don't have to encourage adults at everything. Not everybody is suited for every job. The next thing they talk about in the book is aggression. And this is kind of a pet peeve of mine because I study it. I'm extensively well read on aggression. I've written papers and articles. And when they talk about video game aggression, anytime you ever find anything, you can do a Google Scholar search right now on video game violence, and the first 3 or 4 hits you'll come up with are a guy named Aronson. Or Anderson, sorry, mispronounced that. And he is the champion of hating video games. He's a psychological researcher, and he's about the only one that'll publish negative effects on video games, because the rest of us admit that they aren't there, or that the ones that we do find are so small that it doesn't really matter. So they link, of course, Anderson to the aggression studies on video games, saying that these things are bad. And this is kind of why I'm having this as a discussion this week, because the effects of video, when they find whether video games or media violence or any of these things, first of all, the effects are exceedingly short, as in while they're watching it, which honestly is the same watching a sports game. When you're watching a sports game, there's pretty much no differences between watching a football game and watching a violent movie. while you're watching it, you kind of get excited, and then you're not excited. It's more based on the physiological arousal. Emotion one, if you remember correctly. The children aren't particularly angry. They're just physiologically aroused. And it lasts maybe 5 minutes after the video game or movie is over. And one thing to keep in mind is that movies and video games for children are an emotional sandbox, a way that they can play and explore in a completely safe environment, something that they can't play with and explore in another area. So they've actually found that, and this actually, oddly enough, goes for both violence and pornography. And I think I mentioned this in um, one of the discussion posts that I would bring this up at some point in the semester. But for example, I'll mention pornography here. They've found that boys that are exposed to pornography between, I think, the ages of 9 and 14 are 75% less likely to rape someone than boys who are not exposed to pornography at those ages. And it took a while to figure out why this, because 75% is a huge number. It took a while to figure out why this was the case, and ultimately it turns out that they're not repressed. They're able to explore and look at sexuality and be comfortable with sexuality and understand it on a much more real level. And the people that hate pornography, talk about the dehumanizing of women and everything like that. But honestly, if this was the effect it was actually having, then the people who watch pornography would be more likely to rape women, more likely to objectify women, and in such the opposite is the case. And they found the same thing with emotional sandboxing, emotional play, and violence in movies and video games. It's not necessarily a cathartic release as much as it is the children who are exposed to violence become more well-rounded adults. They do have more violent thoughts. That's absolutely true. Violence does become part of their mentality, but that doesn't mean that they're going to carry them out. Last time I talked about the difference between emotional suppression and cognitive restructuring. Violence is a part of our nature. We're still predators. When it comes right down to it, we're evolved from predators. And violence is a part of our nature. So if we try to suppress the violence, we're going to have all the drawbacks of suppression. We're still going to feel the negative effects. It's going to come back just as strong or stronger. It's one of the weird things with suppression. If you suppress an emotion, the next time it comes out, you feel it even stronger because it's trying to come out. So suppressing the violent nature in us doesn't necessarily work, and perhaps this is why being exposed to vicarious violence, I'm not talking about like your mom beating up your dad, but violence on, say, a safe place like TV or movies or that sort of thing, can actually have positive effects because it allows them to understand it and really think about it in a very objective way because it's not part of them. It's not they're getting beaten up. It's that they're seeing this in a completely objective way. In some ways, it's theorized that video game users are less likely to become bullies because whenever you use violence in a video game, it's always for great cause. You're solving some world quest or trying to throw the One Ring into Mount Doom or something like that. So any other problem seems petty. A kid just called you a name, you're like, well, whatever, you're not threatening the world with nuclear annihilation, so it's not that bad. Um, um, they continue to go through the book and use, unfortunately, kind of soft language, which I spoke of before. It's it's something that clinicians and social workers have a tendency to do, and it makes it difficult to understand what she's talking about. What she's talking about in a lot of this stuff is the emotional education that I've spoken of before, explaining to the children exactly the effects of their actions, how it makes others feel, how they feel about them, how they should feel about them, and how they can handle these feelings. However, this sort of speaking is not a substitution for discipline, and it's not a type of discipline itself. It is a moral exercise that you have to give your children. Um, Next thing I want to talk about is gender typing. Now, one of the articles that I gave you, I've put up the articles at this point, is all about gender typing, and it's a fascinating article. Um, and gender typing is just the idea that the two genders are a little different. Boys and girls are a little bit different, and they're going to act different and behave differently, and all these sorts of things. And the fact is, we are a gendered society, and we're even a gendered species. Um, the gendered society comes out in many ways. Almost all languages have some sort of masculine and feminine, and we do in our language as well. We don't think about it, but if you almost all inanimate important objects are female, and almost all inanimate irrelevant objects are male. So you're a car, a boat. These are all feminine things. So we have kind of a feminized language because everything important is feminine for us. Um, and so it kind of it goes with our whole culture, this idea of both masculine and feminine things. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. To have two things can be different and yet equal at the same time. You know, a glass of lemonade and a glass of fruit punch are equal, they're just different. And in a lot of ways, we as a society are starting to come to understand and accept that. But what doesn't work is telling children things that aren't true, because they can smell a lie pretty easily. Um, so trying to tell them things that you want to be true, like men and women are the same, they're not going to believe. Because men and women are not the same. You have physical differences, if nothing else. They're not the same. They're equal. But there are gender differences. I mean, there's gender differences that we find over and over again and over again. As a scientist, I'll be honest with you, I don't even look for gender differences anymore because I just ask what gender you are. I know I'm going to find a gender difference pretty much no matter what I'm studying. Granted, I study sex and power, so there's obvious gender differences in those. But I consider that the low-hanging fruit of the scientific tree. I know that's what I'm going to find, so I'm never going to base my hypotheses on it. Because the gender differences are so obvious. Um, Now, we can, of course, understand that there are evolutionary reasons why there are gender differences. We have different roles in the tribe, so to speak. And each role is just as vital as the other role. And so we have reasons for these. She talks about gender stereotyping and reducing gender stereotyping. I think this is a bad thing to say when you haven't talked about stereotyping in the entire book. My master's thesis was on prejudice and stereotyping. I studied racism and sexism in the Deep South. And it's important to notice that prejudice in general is a twofold process. There is the completely unconscious, automated part, which is the stereotypical knowledge. And this works for everybody at all times. You see a woman, you see a black guy, whatever, anything that has a stereotype, and all the stereotypical knowledge is going to come into your head. You're gonna. I'll use black people as an example because that's what I studied in the South because the racism was really bad down there. So you see a black guy and you're gonna get all the stereotypes coming to your mind of a black guy. They've changed in the last 10 years. So aggressive, physically strong, possibly more violent, and possibly criminal. Let's say those are the stereotypes. Good athletes. There are a few positive stereotypes too. Keep in mind, stereotyping, and they don't get into this in the book, and they really should. Stereotyping is not necessarily a negative thing. It's not talking about bad things. You take the stereotype of a young black man, and athletic and good at sports is part of this stereotype. It can be positive things as well as negative things. Whether they're true or not is a totally different issue. But that's the automated process. The fact that all these thoughts come into your head. And this works for a black guy just as a black guy sees another black guy. Same thoughts go into his head as when a white guy sees a black guy. The difference is there is then a controlled component, and that is whether or not you choose to believe the stereotypes, whether or not you think they're relevant at that moment. And that is a totally different component. So to say that you need to reduce gender stereotyping is really a bad choice of words, and to show that the author of the book didn't really study prejudice and stereotyping all that much. Um, you can choose not to act on it when it's situationally inappropriate. Um, you can choose not to believe stereotypes, um, but the difference is not really about not having the stereotypes, or even not teaching them that stereotypes are true. Because the fact is, stereotypes are often true. That's actually why recently, by the way, for those of you who aren't 20, you'll have noticed that the black stereotypes have changed a lot in the last 10 years. And the reason for that is because the black community has changed a lot in the last 10 years. 20 years ago, if you were to do statistics of the entire country, blacks were the most impoverished, the fattest. There were more obese blacks than there were any other ethnicity. They had lower rates of college education. But these days, that's totally different. Blacks are actually 20% of the population, and yet they're 30% of the college population right now. I mean, as an ethnicity, it's a really up and coming. Not even up and coming. They've hit that next step. They don't have nearly as much poverty in the communities anymore. I mean, by all means, there are still sections. Right now, actually, Hispanics are the poorest and the most overweight and the most criminal, and those populations, they've kind of taken that place statistically. Um, the stereotypes will change as the population and the situation the population is in has changed, uh, and that just goes to show that the problem isn't stereotypes themselves, but in the application and the knowledge of how stereotypes are used. And this is very important, and will definitely be on a test, so write it down. Um, it's about understanding of statistics. Most people do not understand statistics in a variety of ways, and as somebody who's taken a whole boatload of statistics courses myself, I get to roll my eyes on a daily basis at how people misuse statistics. But the main rule of statistics are that statistics cannot be applied to an individual. And that is just a fact. That is mathematically how they work. They cannot be applied to an individual. And we naturally want to apply them to individual. This is how racial profiling comes up, by the way. This is how gender stereotypes become drawbacks. Because people naturally want to think that the statistic will apply to the individual. So let's say I am in an area and I know that 80% of the black men in that area are criminals. And then there's a black man standing right in front of me. What's the chance that he's a criminal? Now, naturally, our brains want to do something stupid here. They want to say, well, there's an 80% chance he's a criminal. No, he's one guy. He either is a criminal or he is not a criminal. No amount of statistics on his race, on his gender, on his religion, none of these statistics apply to him. He is who he is. Statistics can only affect large groups of individuals. That's what they're all about. This is why racial profiling doesn't work, because that one guy in front of me has nothing to do with a statistic. He's just him. He's either criminal or he isn't. And it's the same with gender stereotypes. It is flat out true that women are less physically strong. They have less muscle density than men. The difference isn't actually as much as most people think. It's a 15% difference. And 15% just isn't that big. But so while it's true that women are generally less physically strong than men, that doesn't mean that the woman standing in front of you is not physically strong. She's one individual. My fiance, for example, she's 5'4". I'm 6 feet tall. I'm about 200 pounds. I cannot beat her arm wrestling. She is a brute. She's also a third-degree black belt in martial arts, and she works out a lot. She's a very physically strong individual. The statistic has nothing on her. It has nothing to do with her. So Don't worry so much about the gender stereotyping or even necessarily the belief in gender stereotyping or any other sort of stereotyping, but rather in the application of stereotypes. Um, and this is unfortunately something that we have to lead by example with, because that's how children pick this stuff up to begin with. And you have a hard time explaining to an adult how to properly use statistics to understand stereotypes. You're certainly not going to explain that to a child. Um, they go a little bit on, since we're talking about genders here, gender identity. Now, one of the articles, a fascinating article called "Exotic Becomes Erotic." Uh, that's one of the options of the articles that we have to read for the next couple of weeks. Um, is all about how people become homosexual, or how some people become homosexual. And this is obviously tied up with gender identity and whatnot. But keep in mind that both gender identity, sexual orientation, which is starting to build at this developmental age that we're talking about, which is why I'm mentioning it, is something that's been hitting the press a lot, and there's a lot of confusion about it because you seem to have two camps of people. You have one camp of people that are saying homosexuality is a choice, and then another camp of people who are saying you are born homosexual. It is not a choice in any way. And as you probably know from the talks that we've had already, anytime people say it's either one or the other, it's usually both, right? There's no just nature or nurture. It's both. And evolutionarily, we're biologically predisposed to one particular orientation or another. We are biologically predisposed to find the members of the opposite sex attractive, obviously. But keep in mind, you look at any other mammals, and homosexuality is rampant. We're biologically predisposed to find our own gender sexually attractive as well. As a matter of fact, I don't think there's a mammal on this planet that doesn't even do interspecies. I mean, the dog that humps your leg does interspecies mating. And this is just normal and a natural thing to do. Um, so we have these biological predispositions to be attracted to pretty much anything that moves, but you're going to be more or less attracted due to a biological predisposition. But there is still a matter of choice involved. Um, uh, so it's going to be both choice and biological predisposition. Because of this, to kind of maximize the child's happiness, it's typically best to acknowledge the biological predisposition and that it's going to be there, and to give the child the option to make whatever choice they're going to be more or less predisposed to do. Because if they're kind of forced into one choice or the other due to social constraints, and I've personally seen this both with homosexuality and heterosexuality. I've seen people, kind of socially manipulated into becoming homosexuals because they were a little predisposed to that, and then ultimately, went back to being heterosexual because they were more predisposed to that. But that was just the social circles that they were running in at the time. And that's ultimately going to lead to less happiness. Um, the last two things that I want to go over before we leave here. The first thing that I want to go over is on page 216. It talks about different child rearing styles. This is very important. It'll definitely be on a test. It's very interesting. There are different child rearing strategies. However, I'm kind of embarrassed. I was kind of embarrassed to even read the book. I'll be honest with you on this, because she was saying that the authoritative was the most successful one, and that is incredibly irresponsible to say, because it's successful assuming that you want one specific kind of child. Now, I mentioned attachment styles and the fact that different cultures like different types of attachment styles. It's the same with this. We might like authoritative parents in the current social atmosphere that we have in our current culture, but 50 years ago we liked authoritarian parents. That was what we considered the most successful. In the 60s, permissive parents were the thing to be. That was the most successful. It depends on what you're going for. My grandmother was a children should be seen and not heard type of woman. And to her, that was the most successful because that was the kind of child that she wanted. So focus less on whether or not something is successful and more on whether or not it's successful at getting whatever it is that you happen to want as a child. And don't push your wants on other people. Because they might have completely different goals, and it could, whether it's cultural or just a particular preference for a certain type of child to rear. The last thing that I want to go over is child maltreatment. They go over at the end of the chapter a whole section on child maltreatment, and they use a lot of those words that I went over before, like abuse or neglect. Oh, that's a horrible one. Um, these are often very culturally subjective, and when they're seen, people often see things like neglect or various types of maltreatment as ways to get power for themselves. It's kind of a psychological motivation on why they see these sorts of things. So if you see a child that's unsupervised, and it's very culturally based, if you see a child that's unsupervised, somebody say, well, they're being neglected. Perhaps in your culture, but it might not be their own. Um, when I was a kid, I was born in 1973, it was the norm to have a baby stroller. And when you went into a store, you left the baby stroller outside of the store because it was considered very rude to bring a baby into a store. Other people would have to deal with it, and it's just, why would you do that to them? Um, it was very rude. So, now of course that would be considered neglect, and it really hasn't been so long. I'm not ancient. This was only 30 years ago. So you kind of have to keep an open mind about these sorts of things and not damn practices that you wouldn't do yourself. Um, Child maltreatment does happen. Obviously, there are children getting beaten and abused and bullied. We'll get into bullying a little bit more next week. And don't don't be so antsy to call it when it's just kind of subjectively there. You really need objective measurements to make these sorts of qualifying judgments. Um, and I say this because I know there's going to be a lot of psychologists and social workers and whatnot who are going to be making qualifying judgments. For the rest of you, well, it's just kind of a anecdotal thing. So there's going to be the test tomorrow on Friday. Good luck, and if you have any questions, let me know.